We've been hearing about the spring offensive to occur in the Ukraine-Russia war for some time now. It's been being hyped in the news almost endlessly. So, thought I would take a little time, go over it, and talk about uh, ways to analyze it and understand what's going on and maybe get a feel for what might be coming. The biggest problem we have making sense of this is that every single source of information we have essentially has a vested interest in the outcome of this. The information from Russia is tainted, the Ukrainian information is tainted, the European news outlets essentially are hoping for a Ukrainian win of some form, whatever victory is, and obviously the US legacy media outlets are similarly interested in seeing some form of Russian defeat, Ukrainian victory. So it's really hard to make sense of a lot of what's going on. Every potential source of news in this conflict has a vested interest in what's going on. Now, take into consideration that this Saudi-Yemeni war has been going on since 2014. Same time period that the Russian-Ukrainian conflict has been going on. And if you're not familiar with the fact that this actually has been a long, slow-boiling war, please check out some of my earlier videos talking about the history of how we got into this. So during the same time period, uh, a war that killed over 300, or well, let's say 350, no, 350,000 fatalities in the Saudi-Yemeni war, and it's barely a blip on the news. Yet we have a war here that's arguably taken at least somewhat less lives and probably a lot less, uh, is nonstop on our news, and we have a clear idea who the good guys and the bad guys are. Now, the Russo-Ukrainian conflict has been rolling along for about the same time period. Reporting was really sparse in the early parts of it because, well, even though it was probably just as important as it is now, it wasn't. Uh, it wasn't the kind of thing that the news wanted to basically spend time on because there was nothing they needed to convince us of. Ukraine, up until about a year ago, was known as one of the most corrupt governments on earth. Yet, on the day of the invasion, we're treated to the Prime Minister going from a bit of a novelty as a former TV comedian to being elevated to a modern day Churchill. The Russian leader is given all the expected comparisons to historical dictators. The Russian troops are barbaric and committing atrocities, and the Ukrainians are sainted defenders of holy ground. Now, if you think these reports should be taken as gospel, I invite you to read about the Germans mounting Belgian babies on their bayonets during World War I. Didn't happen. Now, I'm sure the Russian soldiers do perform nefarious acts. It's hardly a new phenomenon. It always happens in every war. Conscript armies tend to have even less discipline than professional armies. If history is our guide, things are happening, but the reports are likely exaggerated. Every Russian piece of equipment that blows up is something worthy of a victory dance and absolutely heroic, while every attack against the Ukrainians is somehow dastardly and underhanded and evil. The same information purveyors willing to create this very unlikely total good versus total evil scenario are just as likely to distort what is happening on the battlefield to meet the narrative we're supposed to get from said reporting. It's a strange war, supposedly an all-out war, yet we're treated to maybe a once-a-day video depicting a single piece of military equipment being destroyed or a handful of Russians dying in a blast. I do not believe the Russians ever intended on occupying the whole of the Ukraine. I believe they intended to hold Crimea. occupy Donbass in whole or part, decapitate the Ukrainian government, for sure. At the outside, they may have intended on setting up a land bridge to Crimea. And the greatest outlier, I would say, would be trying to take over the eastern half of Ukraine. Essentially, if you look at the history of what Russians have done in the past, if you look at the strategic ground in Ukraine compared to the countries that surround it, if you look at the general army behavior that has occurred in this war, all of this back up this idea that total conquest probably wasn't the Russians' original idea. And again, take a look at my earlier videos to get an idea of what's going on in the history to understand that a little better. The idea of total conquest is an idea told to us by legacy media. It may very well be true, but it's also likely that the total conquest narrative was created in order to make anything less than total conquest seem like a victory for Ukraine. If you set the story up that the Russians' sole goal was to conquer all of Ukraine, and they get hung up at the halfway point because that's all the farther they decided to go in the first place, you can say, well, see, they didn't conquer the whole country because that's what we were telling you they wanted to do. This is a hard thing for a lot of people to understand following the news. You want to be a well-informed person, but it's really hard to be well-informed because a lot of what you're being told is being filtered. Okay? The hardest thing to understand is that diplomacy does not occur over legacy media or the internet. If you see an official statement from the government of another nation being reported to you over legacy media, that's not a message from their government to our government. That's either a message for their people or a message for our people. It has nothing to do with how diplomacy works. Essentially, they talk to each other through what's called diplomatic channels. You have no idea what the Russians have actually said in their media unless you heard it directly. And you speak Russian, or you have a trusty Russian translator. Before the invasion, you can guarantee all sides involved spoke through diplomatic channels. It's likely all sides knew the invasion was coming, and red lines were drawn across the country saying, okay, this is, you cross this line, you know, that's a whole different war. Media frequently reports deliberately mistranslated government proclamations from other countries. Two countries they've been caught routinely with doing this on has been Iran and North Korea. In the case of Iran, they were one of the former presidents of Iran was routinely misquoted, and he had an official UN translator who was actually an Iranian dissident who was now an American citizen, pointing out that several of the most hyperbolic statements that people were attributing to this guy were actually incorrect. And North Korea, essentially we rely on South Korea to tell us what North Korea is saying. And a lot of times their statements are they're never warm and friendly and fuzzy, but they're never quite as horrific as the translators and then media make it out to be. So we don't know what the Russians have said. Maybe they said exactly what the media is saying they're saying, but I can't count on it. We're to believe that everything the Russians do is a mistake, and everything the Ukrainians do is plucky, determined brilliance. Odds don't bear this out. Both sides got to be making mistakes. Both sides got to be having good days and bad days. A scenario where the Russians were pursuing modest gains and Ukrainians surprised them by resisting, and thus protecting the Ukrainian leadership, makes far more sense than the Russians' plan to roll over the entire country with a minimal force and then somehow were stopped. I'd like to give you an excerpt from the publication The Hill. It's about the leaked Pentagon documents, and to me, it's a very interesting document. I have not looked at them in total. I might go over them just to see if I can, if there's good information in them for a story. But the interesting thing is they're trying to infer that the leaked document has been tampered with because numbers in the document don't match what's been coming out of General Milley's mouth. Here's the quote from The Hill. But there are errors. Under a section titled, quote unquote, total assessed losses, one document lists 16 to 17,500 Russian casualties and up to 71,000 Ukrainian casualties. General Mark Milley, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, said publicly last November that Russia has lost, quote unquote, well over 100,000 soldiers, and Ukraine had lost about that many also. Isn't it interesting that they can't draw the other equally likely conclusion that these numbers were correct when they were reported to the Pentagon, and our top general was just making up numbers that matched the narrative he wanted to get out to the media? Why is that so implausible? Now, to clarify, casualties do not mean only deaths. It means dead, captured, and injured. Injured casualties have a potential to return to the battlefield. If the document was correct, and it's 17,000 Russians to 71,000 Ukrainian casualties, then the Ukrainians have already lost, and it's just a matter of meeting the terms that the Russians will accept. If Milley's 100K on each side is true, well, it's bad for Russia, but it's still just as bad for Ukraine. Russians got more people, much more people. They have an 8-to-1 advantage in the demographic that can field soldiers on the ground. More interestingly to me is in the wake of this report, once those numbers came out, it was really important for legacy media to restate over and over again what the real casualty figures are, trying to bolster the original narrative. If this was just kind of a one-off document where it's like, okay, well, yeah, it did come from the Pentagon, but then somebody altered it, and then it was recirculated, wouldn't they just kind of blow it off rather than, no, you can't think this, you have to think the way we're thinking? Makes me lean towards the idea that the document, as we're seeing it, may be correct. Russians are not launching human wave assaults. Okay? We did not see anything that looks like the picture here. The picture here is what a human wave assault looks like. We've not seen any, there is no video evidence, no pictorial evidence of anything like this happening. At best, in the handful of areas that the Russians have been applying pressure to over the winter, they have been sending out 2 to 5 man teams. And these teams are being used to basically draw fire from the Ukrainians. And when the Ukrainians fire and reveal their positions, the Russians drop mortars and artillery on the Ukrainian position. These are not human wave tactics. And they will not result in the kind of numbers that are going to cause the Russians to lose. It's actually much worse for the Ukrainians, because if the Russians lose 2 guys for every 1 guy the Ukrainians lose, the Russians are still winning. The fact that Russia appears to have botched the first part of this war doesn't mean much. The Russians have a long history of botching opening campaigns. Chechnya is a good example. They actually got booted out of Chechnya with their tails between their legs. They came back a year later and conquered it. In fact, it's so significantly under the control of Russia now that there are Chechnyan legions on the battlefield fighting for Russia in the Ukrainian war. Most of the activity we've seen since the big Russian column on the highway until today can be explained far more by mud and unseasonable warmness than the narratives we are told. The mud in this region is legendary. We have tales of it basically it shut down Napoleon's army, it shut down the German army, it shut down the Russian army trying to chase the German army out. It's a well-known phenomenon. Now, one of the things that is making big news is the idea that the Russians are out there conscripting new waves of soldiers to be hauled out to the battlefields. And the Russians are having call-ups for their 18 to 27-year-old cadres. And currently, the Ukrainians have forbid all men ages 18 to 60 from leaving the country. That's a little better indication of who's in more dire straits. The Russians have been bringing up hundreds, if not thousands, of older tanks out of mothballs. However, it's important to note that Ukraine has been using these exact same past their prime tanks since the very beginning. The Russian tanks that are being brought up are being up-armored and up-electronicked. Uses for tanks could be frontline assault. They could also be for secondary line assault, where essentially they go deliberately into areas that they know are light on anti-tank weapons or light on main battle tanks. The Russian military has routinely used essentially what is considered heavy armor and light armor. And these older tanks could be occupying a light armor role. They could be being used for personnel carriers, trying to get men into locations with better protection. They could be being used as standoff weapons, being remounted with other types of armament, anti-tank missiles, etc., similar to what the Ukrainians did. Older tanks make great command vehicles. They can be reutilized to become bridge layers. In fact, the United States just gave Ukraine a whole bunch of old M60s that are bridge layers. Essentially, they're armored enough to where they can get into position to drop a bridge. Same thing for minesweepers. Tanks can be converted into minesweepers, and much better to use an older tank than it is a newer tank to do it. One of the things to understand is tank-on-tank fighting in this war has pretty much not happened. All the tanks are pretty much being killed by from air-to-ground missiles from fighter jets and helicopters and ground anti-tank missiles. The key thing is, everything you're seeing in this war, all the little videos of things blowing up, all the little lines on the map, the various, we're calling people up here, we got people here, we're fighting this battle here, it lacks context. I'm not saying none of it's true. I think most of it's true to some extent, if not mostly true. But without context, we don't really know what these individual pieces mean. And the way they're being presented doesn't follow the logic of what we're actually seeing. So, we have a Russian army whose goal may be as modest as taking the Donbass and keeping Crimea. Their goals might be as far-reaching as total conquest of Ukraine. So the thing is if it were true that total conquest isn't their objective, reports of them pulling back or being pushed back might be meaningless. Take, for example, when Russia invaded Georgia, they overran most of the country. They pummeled the Georgian military, and they just basically dropped bombs all over the place, just essentially be dicks. And then when they were done having their fun, they essentially pulled out of most of Georgia, and they basically reoccupied South Ossetia and the other places that they considered to be Russian majority areas, and the Georgians have been left alone ever since. No one ever suggested the Russians routed the Russians back to their locations. The Russians still occupy that Georgian territory that they planned on taking from the beginning. Okay. Ukraine is going to be facing a much larger, better equipped Russian army than the one that invaded Ukraine last year. The Russians have fortified strong points that will allow them to concentrate on the areas of the lines they consider critical. The bulk of the army has had the opportunity to rest. There will be at least double, if not triple, the amount of troops on the ground that originally went into Ukraine. The Ukrainian army has been given opportunities and challenges. The bulk of Ukraine's army has been occupying strong points against attrition attacks all winter long. They may be tired, and their reserves are limited. Some 45 to 60,000 Ukrainian troops will be coming back to the line after receiving NATO training. This core army will be far better trained than the one the Russians went up against during the first phase of their invasion. The Ukrainians are bristling with NATO high-tech gear. And this is kind of a two-edged sword. On one hand, potentially much greater capabilities. On the other hand, it creates huge training and logistical hurdles. Essentially, they're getting very different equipment from all these different countries. Equipment that was very different from the stuff they were fielding initially. So you run into the problem of, if you've got 5 or 6 different types of anti-aircraft missiles, keeping the logistics flowing to keep those things all running when parts and things wear out is more difficult than if you only have 1 or 2 that are native and you're familiar with. They may lack the capacity to repair stuff. They may have some areas where they're very thinly trained. Imagine the operating system for, let's stay with the anti-air missiles. The operating system for a modern anti-air system is probably some fairly intense level training. And if you've got more than a half dozen different units from different countries, you're going to be spread thin on people who are experts on each one. And one of the problems you run into is, one badly placed enemy explosion takes out a handful of people who are the only ones who know how to run things at the optimum level. Suddenly the piece of equipment isn't nearly as useful as it was before. Ukraine will have available to it the full might of the U.S. surveillance state. This will give them an edge on the defensive for sure. The big question will be, can the Ukrainian army execute highly complex maneuver warfare while avoiding casualties? The Ukrainians need to be able to move through the best ground at the fastest speed while inflicting something in the neighborhood of 8 casualties on the Russians for every Ukrainian lost. This would be tricky for an army that's been training like this for decades. The Ukrainians probably aren't trained well in this type of maneuver warfare. The Russians aren't, and that's where they have their historical background from. Unless there are huge economic problems in Russia, the type that basically paralyze their economy, Russia can choose to dig in for the long haul. They can choose to be moderately reckless with the lives of their troops. They could lose 2 or 3 to 1 pushing around just to see if they get lucky and have a breakthrough. Lose troops and go, oh, well, that didn't work, but boy, we probably killed a lot of Ukrainians while doing it. Soldiers the Ukrainians can't replace and soldiers we can. They could also consider doing some very audacious moves until they take too many casualties to continue doing them. So essentially, Ukraine has very minimal options where the Russians have all the options available to them. Ukraine has to choose between total defense or absolutely flawless brilliance on the battlefield, and they don't have room for missteps or partial successes. The Russians have the upper hand in this, And at this point, it's their war to lose. A war they still very well could. So, has anybody read the leaked Pentagon papers? Any thoughts on this erroneous figure that was added into them? Any thoughts on the spring offensive? Do you have a source you like that you think has a better take on what might happen? Please throw your ideas in the comments below. Smash the like button. If the YouTube algorithm brought you here and you're not a regular subscriber, please consider subscribing. And if there's somebody you think might find this interesting, share it with them. Thanks for spending time with me this evening. Hope to see you again in a future video.